This is the most important part of a double apex corner. It's the point where we're as far away from the inside curb as we're ever going to be. And it's also precisely the point that you should get on throttle in every double apex corner. I've coached hundreds of students in the last year, including real world racing drivers, and I see so many fast drivers get lost in double apex corners. So I'm going to tell you how to identify which corners to double apex, show you how to modify the racing line during these corners, and explain precisely how to find lap time and master double apex corners, which are characterised by taking a very early first apex, running out from the apex in the mid corner towards the maximum deviation point, then bringing the car back closer to the inside of the track to take a late second apex. But not all corners are faster with a double apex racing line, and a corner needs to meet two criteria in order to be more favourable for a double apex. These criteria are a high cornering angle and a large corner radius. Cornering angle simply refers to the angle of your heading before and after the corner, and corner radius is simply the distance over which you travel through that angle. A high corner angle over a short radius, for example a tight hairpin, is never going to be faster with a double apex, and neither is a corner with a low corner angle over a larger radius. But combine the two and a double apex will almost always be the fastest approach, because the advantage of a double apex corner is that it allows you to do a lot more braking within the corner, meaning we can start braking later and carry more entry speed than if we tried to take a late single apex approach to the same corner. So we have a sense of which corners to double apex, but what do we actually need to focus on in double apex corners? So really the key to double apex corners is this maximum deviation point. Everything that comes before the maximum deviation point in a double apex corner is kind of in service of finding the right maximum deviation point, and everything that comes after the maximum deviation point, i.e. like the second apex, is pretty much caused by the position of the maximum deviation point. So we're coming up to double apex corner now, and I just want to show you exactly what I mean by the maximum deviation point. So super slow, we take a first apex, and after the first apex we're washing out in the corner, washing out. This is way too far, but there's a point round about here where we're as far away from the inside curb as we're ever going to be, and then the rest of the corner coming in for the double apex, we're moving back towards the inside of the corner until we wash out again. So the maximum deviation point is this point, the point where we're as far away from the inside of the corner as we're ever going to be. So first I'm going to show you what a good maximum deviation point looks like. So early first apex, washing out in the middle, coming back in for the second apex, and we're able to commit to the throttle very early on in the corner, actually exactly at the maximum deviation point, which is something we will talk about a little bit later. But that's an idea of what a good double apex corner looks like. Not perfect, but good. Now I'm going to show you what happens if we take too early of a maximum deviation point and too late of a maximum deviation point. So I'm going to show you what an early maximum deviation point looks like, and we'll talk about how to do this a little bit later. But early maximum deviation point, try to get on throttle, try to commit. We almost miss the second apex, and we spin on the exit. So what happens when we take an earlier maximum deviation point? The second apex is shifted earlier in the corner, and if we take too early of a second apex, we're struggling to get on throttle at the right point, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the consequence is either we have to lift off, or we spend a long time kind of feathering the throttle, or we have what happens here. Either we spin because we're asking too much of the rears, or we run wide on the exit of the corner. So I'll show you now what a late maximum deviation point looks like. So really late in the corner, we get on throttle, but it's all a little bit too easy. We don't have to use all of the track on the exit, and that's because when we take a later maximum deviation point, we take a later second apex position, and if we apex a corner too late, same in single apex corners, if we apex a corner too late, we don't end up having to use all of the track on the exit, and therefore we're just slow on the exit because we weren't forced to use all of the track. So we can see that the maximum deviation point is important, but how can we control it? There are 4 things we need to know to control the maximum deviation point, but don't worry, I'll show you how we can use each of them to understand double apex corners. So the first way we can modify the maximum deviation point is by changing the first apex in the double apex corner. And we're here at Silverstone because there's a very good double apex corner here with Brooklands into Luffield, where The first apex position is key in this corner to getting the double apex right, and it's made even more difficult, we'll see when we get through to Brooklands, by the fact that in order to take Brooklands correctly, and the fastest way around that section of the track is to over prioritize Brooklands, the first corner, the left-hander that we'll come up to in a second, and under prioritize the right-hander, the double apex corner, which is Village. And so because we're not able to use all of the track going into Village, which we'll see in a second, the ability to take a later first apex is massively compromised, and you'll see that the difference in first apex position makes a lot of difference to how we take the corner. So we try and take a late first apex, come out, late maximum deviation point, back in for a late second apex, a little bit of oversteer on the cold tyres, but that is a reasonable way to take Brooklands and Luffield, and specifically Luffield being the double apex corner here. So we're going to try and take an early first apex now into Luffield, so we'll see what that does to the maximum deviation point and to the second apex position. So excessively early first apex, and we come back in, try and plant the throttle, and same as we saw before, because we've taken an earlier first apex, the maximum deviation point is shifted earlier in the corner. It means the second apex position is shifted earlier in the corner, and we struggle to get the power down. So we're going for a late first apex now into Luffield, and we'll see what that does to the maximum deviation point and to the second apex position. So we compromise Brooklands a little bit more, get a really late first apex, really late maximum deviation point, late second apex that we miss, and even though we miss the second apex, we're still super under the limit on the exit. We didn't have to use all of the track on the exit, so by taking too late of a first apex, we shifted the maximum deviation point too late in the corner, which shifted what would have been the second apex too late in the corner, and then the exit of the corner is just completely under the limit. There's actually one more way that changing the first apex position changes the maximum deviation point. So when we take an early first apex, not only do we take an earlier maximum deviation point, but we take a maximum deviation point that's further away from the inside curb. So we take an early first apex, we wash out massively in the mid corner, and then we come back early second apex, but because we washed out a long way, we had a wider maximum deviation point, we kind of got away with it. If we now try taking a late first apex, what we'll see is that not only do we shift the maximum deviation point later in the corner, but we also shift it closer to the inside curbing. So what you'll hopefully see now is that we stay way tighter in the middle, we take a way tighter maximum deviation point, not washing out anywhere near as far away from the inside curb this time, and get on throttle. Missed the second apex a little bit again. That was a little bit too late, and you can tell because we were under the limit on the exit. So we can see that with a later first apex, we take a later maximum deviation point, and by extension a later second apex. But we can also modify the maximum deviation point by modifying our entry speed into the corner. So we're at Spa now, and I want to show you how just changing the entry speed into a double apex corner also influences the maximum deviation point, and therefore also influences the second apex position. And I should say this is going to be a pretty hard variable to show, because what I've got to do is try and keep exactly the same first apex position while varying the entry speed into the corner. And I should say that all of the live driving examples in this video, they're not going to be perfect because it is very hard to isolate one variable in the driving. But when it comes to improving this yourself, you can play with each of the variables, get a feeling for what each of the variables does, and in time, as you get used to this, you won't have to think about the individual variables. You'll just approach the double apex corner as a whole, and you'll have a feeling of whether you've taken too late of a maximum deviation point, too early of a maximum deviation point, too far out, too far in, and you'll start to build like an intuitive sense of what you need to change in order to get the right maximum deviation point. So we will set an active reset point here. And first off, I'm going to try and show you just where I'm aiming to first apex in these two examples. I'm going to do like a slow entry speed example and a fast entry speed example, but the point that I'm going to try and double apex is right where this active reset point is here. So if we can hit roughly that first apex with varying entry speed, hopefully we'll be able to see the effect of just the entry speed on the maximum deviation point and on the double apex corner as a whole. So we're going to start off with a low entry speed into the corner while still trying to hit the same first apex, and we'll see what this does to the double apex corner. So low entry speed, early maximum deviation point, and we're staying inside to the corner as well. So it's early maximum deviation point, tight maximum deviation point, and as a consequence we take a very early second apex and we have to delay getting to full throttle. So either we delay getting to full throttle because we've taken too early of a second apex, or we try to get on throttle fully early and we spin like we saw in the previous clip. So this time around we're going to try and carry more entry speed into the corner. We're still going to try and take the same first apex, and we're going to see what this does to the maximum deviation point. So a lot of entry speed now, same first apex, and you see we wash out far deeper, far later maximum deviation point, far later second apex position. And that was with as much as I can keeping the same first apex position, and so we can see that carrying more entry speed into the corner shifts the maximum deviation point later in the corner, shifts second apex position later into the corner. But there's one thing we've completely ignored up until this point, and that's the shape of the racing line through double apex corners. Both of these corners require a double apex, but the optimal racing line through each corner is radically different. Specifically, this difference is known as the eccentricity of the racing line. The more oval shaped a racing line is, the more eccentric it is. Some double apex corners require a more eccentric racing line, and some require a more circular racing line. But in any given corner, we can play with the shape of our racing line, subtly changing our inputs to make the racing line more circular or more oval shaped. How? By modifying the way we reach the limit of grip in these corners. So I want to show you what makes a racing line more circular or more oval shaped, and we're at the centripetal circuit for this. And we're going to start out by just driving to the 100 meter line, and we're going to corner the car on the limit of grip on this 100 meter line. So we're at the 100 meter line here. We're going to try and hug the inside of this line, so lining it up with the kind of edge of the car, something like this. And we're going to get up to the speed we need to get up to both be on the limit of grip and maintaining this circular path. So that's right around here. We're pretty close to the limit, and if we maintain a constant speed now, we will maintain a constant line, constant circular racing line. And as soon as we start to gently apply the brake, or as soon as we even start to lift off the throttle while staying on the limit, watch what's going to happen. So we'll get back to this circular line, maintaining constant speed, and if we lift off the throttle while trying to stay on the limit, our line's tightening, 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 tightening. We're always on the limit pretty much here, but we're continuing in like a ever tightening racing line, a more eccentric racing line. The reason for that is as we decrease our speed, and we're decreasing our speed just by the engine braking of the car in this case, as we decrease our speed we have more ability to turn, and therefore the line we take tightens. So the more we decelerate on entry, the more eccentric the racing line becomes. That's why the racing line at turn 1 into Laguna Seca is more eccentric, because compared to Luffield at Silverstone, we do more braking on entry, leading to a more oval shaped racing line. Even though certain corners naturally lead us to a more circular or oval shaped racing line, we can still modify our inputs within the corner to control the degree to which our racing line is oval shaped or circular. So how can we modify our inputs within the same corner to vary the racing line from oval shaped to circular? And how does that variation of circular to oval shaped racing line affect the maximum deviation point, and therefore how does it affect the second apex position? Well, on the entry to the corner we've got two tools to bring the car to the limit of grip. We can bring the car to the limit of grip with the braking, or we can bring the car to the limit of grip with the steering. And we've already shown that the more braking we do, the more we decelerate the car, the more we shift towards a more oval shaped, a more eccentric racing line. And this is exactly what holds true within double apex corners as well. So we've got 100% grip to be able to use, and we can choose to use that grip either mostly through the steering, i.e. we do a lot of steering and not very much braking, and we use most of that grip to corner the car, or we can use most of the grip to decelerate the car, most of the grip for braking, and do a small amount of steering. And so we've got two options. We can bring the car to the limit more with the steering and less with the brakes, in which case we have a more circular racing line, or we can bring the car to the limit more with the brakes and less with the steering, in which case we have a more oval shaped racing line. So again, back at the same double apex corner, and I'm going to try and vary both of these things. So I'm going to try now and get a fairly circular racing line, so bringing the car to the limit more with the steering than the brakes, and we'll see how that affects things. So lots of steering as much as I can, not very much braking. We have a very late maximum deviation point. We also keep the maximum deviation point quite tight to the inside of the corner, and the net effect of these two things, a late maximum deviation point and bringing the maximum deviation point tighter to the inside of the corner, the result is that we take a late second apex, and actually we missed the second apex again. We were under the limit because we shifted the maximum deviation point so late in the corner because of the circular racing line. So now we're going to try bringing the car to the limit more with the brakes, taking more oval shaped racing line, and we'll see how that changes things. So we're going for a more oval shaped racing line now, bringing the car to the limit more with the brakes than the steering. So not very much steering, lots of brakes. You see we have a early maximum deviation point, and also a maximum deviation point that's pushed out a lot further from the inside curb, and the net effect is that we take an earlier second apex. You can see I was so much on the brakes there that I was getting oversteer in the mid corner, but disregarding that oversteer in the mid corner, the net effect of a more oval shaped racing line, the net effect of bringing the car to the limit more with the brakes than the steering, is that we shift the maximum deviation point earlier in the corner, but we also push further out from the inside curbing. The final piece of the puzzle, and a major source of confusion for many drivers, is working out when they should get on throttle in double apex corners. The answer that we touched on at the start of the video is that as long as we're driving the car on the limit of grip, we want to be getting on throttle at the maximum deviation point. As soon as you feel like you're starting to transition from pointing away from the corner back towards turning into the corner, this is the point that you should be getting back on throttle. But in all of the live driving sections of the video, I have already been getting on throttle at the maximum deviation point, and yet there have been corners where I've been both under the limit on exit and over the limit on exit. So why am I saying to get on throttle at the maximum deviation point? Because in these situations, it's not that the point you were getting on throttle was wrong, it's that the position of your second apex was wrong. If you end up having to lift off of the throttle on exit, even when getting on throttle at the maximum deviation point, then you need to shift your second apex later in the corner. And how do we shift the second apex later? By shifting the maximum deviation point later in the corner. And by extension, we naturally end up getting on throttle later because the maximum deviation point occurs later in the corner. And equally, if you find yourself not having to use all of the track on exit, even when you get on throttle at the maximum deviation point, then you need to shift your second apex, maximum deviation point, and throttle application earlier in the corner. And this concept of throttle application at the maximum deviation point is actually just a niche application of a far more universally applicable rule for throttle application that I discuss in detail in my online course, iRacing Fundamentals. And throttle application in itself is just a small part of the contents of the course. You can get a free 7-day trial of the course via the link in the description.